Because if you're spoon-fed what the press is giving you, you're not getting the full picture.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's so important you're going around the country and doing this.
Yeah.
What would you say, just to kick it off, and by the way, by way of format, we've got other microphones. If we say anything that's interesting, just raise your hand. This is supposed to be a discussion. It's not just an interview, so please, we want this to be as interactive as possible. What would you say is kind of the seminal issue of this campaign that you're running and that you're most passionate about? I know there's so many, but what really is driving you?
Well, thanks, first of all, Omeed, for hosting us, gathering us together here today, inviting your friends and their friends to come out and give me this opportunity to introduce myself. Just by way of brief background, which is linked to the answer to your question, I'm a soldier. I'm in the Army National Guard. I've served now for over 16 years there and deployed twice to the Middle East. This experience has deeply shaped who I am as a person. And has been a major motivating force for me to run for Congress back in 2012. In that race, it was seen as an impossible campaign. Previous to that, I had served in the state legislature and on the Honolulu City Council. I had come back from Iraq, deploying to Iraq in 2005, deeply changed and trying to figure out how I could be in a position to influence policy. You know, going there and being exposed to seeing the high human cost of war, being exposed to what I saw as the deep corruption and waste and abuse of taxpayer dollars by defense contractors like KBR Halliburton. In our camp in Iraq, which was about 40 miles north of Baghdad, whether it was, you know, going into the chow hall or the porta potties in our camp, every single thing in our camp was stamped with KBR Halliburton. I started talking with some of the folks who were coming to work there from Nepal and the Philippines and Sri Lanka and other countries, because this was a better opportunity than they had to earn money in their home country. They were, you know, getting $500 a month, working 12-hour days, 6 days a week. It was crazy. So coming back just with all of these experiences, I wanted to be in a position to make an impact, a positive impact. Deployed a second time, came back, and had the opportunity eventually to run for Congress, because I saw that as a way where I could be in the rooms where they're making the decisions about how our foreign policy is executed, what our foreign policy is. And for me, ultimately, that driver was saying, hey, we've got to end these wasteful regime change wars, these wars that are actually undermining our own national security, strengthening terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, incredible waste of taxpayer dollars, what to speak of the cost that is paid for by our service members, and the devastating impact that it has on the people in the countries where we wage these wars. So that experience drove me to run for Congress. It was an impossible campaign. We were running against somebody who had 100% name ID. I had 3% name recognition when we first started. Everyone said, there's no way you can win, Tulsi. We like you. We think you've got a bright future, but why don't you wait 10, 15, 20 years and then come back and try again? But what that campaign really showed was the power of people who were looking for fresh leadership that's focused on putting people in our country first.
Yeah, and I mean, to pick it up, it's also interconnected, because we talked about last time, not one of these issues is a monolith. So you think about why 2016 happened, it was clearly a culmination of many different issues.
Yeah.
You're focusing on these unnecessary regime change wars, and what's interesting, it's not just a moral argument you're making an economic one,
right,
which is that this is wasteful where we could be spending this money at home.
Yeah.
And when you don't do that, you have a certain segment of society that's sent to fight the wars, who then come back and aren't trained in the new economy. Yeah. And then you lead to things like the opioid crisis, and it's just a spiraling effect. Yeah. And then you have kind of a reaction.
That's right.
Right? And so...
And that's really, just to close that point, and then we'll grab your question, just to... the reason why I'm making foreign policy a central pillar in this campaign is because of that very reason. We can talk about healthcare, education, infrastructure, our economy, all of these things that we need to be focusing on and making investments on. But so long as we have this continued drain on our resources, this trillions of dollars since 9/11 alone, we're not going to begin to have the resources we need to focus where they're needed.
And can you just introduce yourself and your
My name is Carl DeStefano. that we would have all these unnecessary wars if we had a draft? First question. Second, did you really go there thinking that you were there to defend our freedoms, where 90% of Americans can't even find Iraq on the map?
Yeah. Good questions. Did you hear in the back? Were you able to hear? Okay, cool. I'll answer your second question first. Look, I believed what we were told prior to the Iraq War, like a lot of people in this country. We were lied to. And my experience in being there was a huge eye-opening thing when I saw, hey, this is not a war going after the terrorists who attacked New York City on September 11th. There's something else happening here. And that, for me, changed so much. And it's what motivated me to come back and say, this cannot be allowed to happen again. The decision that I made, it was 2004. I was serving in the State House of Representatives in Hawaii at the time. Our brigade was activated for deployment to Iraq. It was going to be an 18-month-long deployment. And while there were close to 3,000 soldiers who were on that mandatory deployment roster, my name wasn't on the list. And I called my commander. I said, hey, what's going on? I don't see my name on this deployment roster. He says, oh, congratulations, you don't have to go. I knew there was no way that I could stay home and watch my brothers and sisters march off to war on the other side of the world. So I stepped away from my seat in the State House, volunteered to deploy, got trained in a different job that they need filled, and went with my brothers and sisters in uniform to Iraq for over a year. Your question about the draft, I don't know the answer to that. I don't think that the draft, I don't think we should reinstate the draft, because as a soldier, I don't want to be downrange with somebody who doesn't want to be there.
Yeah, but the question was not should it be reinstated, but if we had a draft, do you think we would have unnecessary wars?
I don't know the answer to that, because, and the reason why I don't think that will solve the problem is because the deeper issue is those who benefit from these continued wars are the ones who continue to push and beat these war drums, and they will continue to profit, just as they did back in Vietnam. I think that if there was the draft as in Vietnam, you would probably have a lot more people in this country who were thinking about these issues. It would be more top of mind. They would hold their leaders more accountable. And so when we talk about the cost of war, every single service member, every single military family, we feel this. We continue to feel this now. We still have troops who are being killed overseas now in countries like Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq. But this is why everywhere I go, in every town, every living room, every kitchen, for those who don't have that direct connection to the human cost of war, I talk to them, well, what do you care about? Well, healthcare is a huge issue on people's minds. We talk about the lack of resources. Addressing the cost of war in our foreign policy is central to our being able to make sure that we've got quality healthcare, to make sure people have clean water to drink in this country. It's not a guarantee. People don't have that in a lot of communities across the country. Things like protecting our environment, rebuilding crumbling infrastructure. So while reporters will sometimes say, hey, well, why do you talk about foreign policy so much? This is why, because it is central to everything else. And for the rest of the candidates who are not addressing this issue, even though the most important responsibility that the president has is to be commander-in-chief, they're making a lot of promises that will turn out to be empty because they're not dealing with this drain on our taxpayer dollars and where it's currently going.
Yeah, please.
Congressman, why Pentagon is not audited? Actually, if I'm correct, why it is? Why? What Congress is going for? What is special about Pentagon?
There is nothing special about the Pentagon. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, and for as long as I've been there, we have been pushing, passing legislation, mandating, giving deadlines to the Pentagon to complete this audit. Every single year they come back and just say, well, excuses, it hasn't been done, we're close, we're not there yet, there have been some problems, and this is something that we are continuing to hold their feet to the fire for. What we see, kind of leaking out here and there are different examples of the waste and abuse of taxpayer dollars within the Pentagon. We see examples of how there are billions of dollars that have gone completely unaccounted for, where they don't even know where it went. And yet they come back every year asking for more money. So the leadership now in the Armed Services Committee, I think, is improving in holding them accountable and saying, look, we're not going to continue to sign blank checks for you when you're not being accountable to taxpayers about where this money is going. You can say, and this is the problem in Washington, though, is if you ask the tough questions or if you vote against the authorization bill, which is basically the budget for the Department of Defense, you'll be criticized. Well, why do you hate our troops?
Well, you have the credibility to do that.
I do,
Yeah,
because
right.
I'm a soldier. I love my country and I love our troops. And I know that when we're not putting the resources where they're needed, it's actually dishonoring the service and sacrifice of our service members. But the mentality in Washington is unless you are in lockstep with the military-industrial complex and people who want to continue to send our troops to fight in wasteful, unnecessary wars, then you're not a patriot and you don't love America.
I mean, this message definitely resonates. This sounds a lot like how Trump sounded in 2015. I'm not comparing you to him. I'm just saying that, he talked a lot like this. He was saying bold
I think he
things.
heard some of my speeches back in 2014,
He
actually.
must have, right? Because he would go up there. Remember in the primary, he said, we were lied to about Iraq. Democratic side wasn't even saying that. I mean, so obviously he's changed and he hasn't delivered on a lot of what he was saying. But clearly this message will resonate and has resonated with a large swath of the country for a variety of reasons. And Carl, I think your point that you were making is if people's sons and daughters were going to war, they were making the decisions, obviously it would affect them. In how bellicose they were being. You've heard of those people as chicken hawks, right?
Yeah.
Who let other people fight their wars.
Yeah.
Please.
I've got a quick question.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
Just to follow up on the point you were talking about the Pentagon. The Government Accountability Office, does that report on the Pentagon and what have they said recently? I mean, do they audit them regularly,
the GAO has issued different reports, and this is where we have found some of these egregious examples of waste and abuse, but that's really all they can do is report. And basically, they're commissioned by Congress to conduct studies or reports on different sections and different parts of the government. But even they have not done a full accounting of the entire Department of Defense budget. And in fact, I just heard about a week ago, there is a specific office that was created to account for spending in Afghanistan, the so-called rebuilding effort in Afghanistan. And this is where a few years ago they reported on this gas station built in the middle of Afghanistan that cost us something like $250 million that couldn't be used because the vehicles that the Afghan people didn't take that kind of fuel. It was this whole boondoggle. Well, there are efforts underway right now to completely defund this office so that they are no longer able to account for and provide oversight for the over $4 billion a month that we are continuing to spend in Afghanistan. So this is something we're looking at legislatively. How can we mandate that this office and others like it are kept in place so that we can hold them accountable for the spending?
In the back.
Why do you think other presidential candidates who've gone with a similar anti-interventionist message have failed to deliver on that message once they got into office? Do you think maybe they learned something they didn't know ahead of time, they were gotten to by some of these interests? Maybe the president doesn't have as much power as we think they do to end these wars. Which do you think it is?
Without being them and sitting in their shoes and getting the information they're getting, but coming from my own experience and from what I've seen and witnessed, they have lacked experience and conviction. I'm not running for president because I've had some lifelong dream to be president. I'm running for president specifically because of these experiences that I've had and because I know that there are great limitations to my ability to impact these decisions in Congress as one of 435. But as president, you're sitting there and you're making that decision about about our foreign policy, about when and where our troops are going to combat. And so there's a few things. I think, we have presidents in both parties for too long who've completely ignored Congress's constitutional responsibility to declare war. I've introduced legislation called the No More Presidential Wars Act, because the president should only be sending our troops into harm's way really as a response to a direct threat. Otherwise, Congress is the one that has to bear that responsibility, and it's a great responsibility to declare war, to authorize the use of military force. The influence of the foreign policy establishment and the defense industry in Washington is great. It's great. And when we look at both Republican and Democrat presidents, you can see how their policies really, as it relates to the military and foreign policy, haven't really shifted, regardless of who's in the Oval Office. Why is that? We look at who's surrounding them. Who are they listening to? Who's sitting in their cabinet? They are people who have, Defense Secretary Robert Gates is someone who served for many different administrations in different positions and, frankly, not done very well through those different positions, but he kept getting promoted. And we're seeing those policies all the way back from when the Soviet war in Afghanistan was going on and we were arming, exactly, the Mujahideen, you're seeing how these policies haven't changed over decades. That's why. So if you have a president who goes in, who lacks the experience and conviction about these issues and the need to provide real leadership, then they end up getting influenced by those around them. And in my view, continuing these destructive, wrong decisions that actually undermine our national security, undermine the well-being of our people, and end up causing extreme devastation and suffering for people in other parts of the country. This is why I took the opportunity in November of 2016, 2 weeks after Trump got elected, to go in and talk to him. Because my hope was, hey, maybe I can come in, share the truth and the reality of what's going on in Syria, my experience in Iraq, the need to end these regime change wars, to not listen to these chicken hawks in Washington from both parties before he started surrounding himself with people like John Bolton, who was being talked about a lot back then. That was my hope in meeting with him, and unfortunately he chose to surround himself with those people who are pushing us closer and closer to war now. Places like Iran. It's very, very dangerous.
Ali, did you?
Yeah, so Carl's question, I think, in a way, was getting at this alignment of interests. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these questions have. And I know we're specifically talking about foreign policy.
Yeah.
But, so let's use foreign policy as an example. You're talking about sort of the Halliburton branding. Mm-hmm. How do you do anything? Republican, Democrat, Congress, Senate, how do you do anything given the lobby?
Yeah.
You're talking about surrounding yourself with people or economic interests.
Yeah.
And, that's the thing that I always come back to. I just can't figure out how you actually, even if you have that conviction and you have that experience, because thankfully no one governs alone. Mm-hmm. Given the system that we have in place, which is different than systems in the rest of the world, can you, having been there and seen it, can you get through that to a place where people in power are making decisions that don't have a million different personal and societal economic consequences?
I mean, this is really what's at the heart of all of this. Yes, to foreign policy, but across the board. And the challenge is great because it's a deeply entrenched system. I think where I find hope and opportunity is that through the transparency and frankly the power of new media and social media, people have a lot more access to information where they're actually seeing and connecting these dots between kind of the moneyed lobbying interests and the final result or the votes that's taken or the policy that's passed. I don't take any PAC contributions or lobbyist contributions in my campaign. Purely a people-powered campaign, individual contributions, and voters in this country we're seeing are starting to demand that of their candidates for Congress, of the U.S. Senate. That's really the way that we change the influence, because then there's no question about who you're accountable to. I mean, I could tell you a ton of stories about people who I know in Congress who are running, big campaigns. They record a TV ad saying what they really want to say about how pharmaceutical drug prices are increasing at exponential amounts, hurting sick people. They play the ad, and some of their big pharma PAC contributors say, "Nope, you're not gonna show that ad in public. You got to re-record it." And they did. Because, hey, they're funneling $1 million into this super PAC that's going to help run negative ads against their opponent, and they need that money to be able to win. But this is exactly what's wrong. This is what's wrong with this system. We've seen in the 2016 election, and we've seen in a lot of congressional campaigns, the power of people and our voices when we choose to lift those voices, both through our votes and through our contributions, and saying, hey, we're going to change this system. That's ultimately how we get through. And having strong principled leaders who are not going to bend to the wishes of those very few in Washington who've kind of held court for too long.
Charles.
So, I wanted to ask you on the oversight authority and with President Trump, refusing to comply with all subpoenas.
Yeah.
What enforcement authority or power does the House have in the end to not only be able to exercise your oversight role, but actually reassert yourself as a co-equal branch of government? It just seems like it's kind of stalled.
Yeah. And
the president seems to be winning this, conflict between the executive and the House.
Yeah. The oversight investigations that have been going on and will continue to go on, I think, shines a light in transparency and forces these issues to be reckoned with in the public square. But ultimately, the power that Congress has is the power of the purse strings when it comes right down to it. Obviously, this is why elections matter so much, so that we do actually have this co-equal branch of government that's holding an administration accountable. It's tough, though. I mean, I so much of these subpoenas are going ignored. People are not respecting the role that all of us have as members of Congress in just showing up and having that public transparency. As far as the legal mechanisms, I'm not well versed on all of them, but given how many of these things have been going ignored, even an impeachment vote or holding in contempt, like ultimately at a practical level, what real result will that bring? These guys are not going to lose their jobs. It's not going to happen. The Senate's not going to cooperate. But if we do our jobs in the House, where the budget originates, where these appropriations bills originate, that's ultimately the power that Congress has.
Do you favor impeachment?
I think that ultimately, if we think about what's best for the country, impeachment will further tear our country apart. I think it's important for the country to defeat Donald Trump in 2020 and to make our case to voters to make that decision. So there's no question, there's no doubt about the direction the American people want to go in this country. Otherwise, in my view, we're just going to keep relitigating us versus them that began in 2016, and it's not going to do anything in helping us actually address whether it's foreign policy, healthcare, all of these domestic issues that really are impacting people in their everyday lives. And that's something that really struck me as I've been out on the road for the last several months in the early states and in different communities. Prior to the Mueller report being released in April, in the previous 5 months, let's say, I got one question about the Mueller report. One question. So it was consuming the news cycle in Washington every single day, not at all what people are thinking about out in their communities. And what they feel like is, why aren't you guys listening to us? Why aren't you paying attention to us? That's not what we're dealing. That's not what keeps us up at night. And I think that's so important for us, look, as Democrats, as a party, but really for the country, that we've got to get back to focusing on, hey, we've got real problems that we need to address. We've got to work together and find ways to do that.
And Charles, I've heard that from at least 7 congressmen and women around the country. No one asks about impeachment or Mueller in their local districts at all. And Tulsi made that point when we interviewed her a few weeks ago as well. It was a very powerful point that it just shows a disconnect between the Beltway and the rest of the country. We had here about, Joe, what was it, a couple weeks ago, we had Antonio Delgado, who represents kind of central upstate New York. It's a rather Republican-leaning district, but he was able to win in 2018. His top 2 issues in his district, and I think they're maybe, hopefully, probably a microcosm for the national, were healthcare.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the one that we found most surprising was climate change.
Yeah.
And he said most Republicans were asking me about climate change because they were farmers.
Interesting.
So that was just like, that really threw the room off a bit.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you have similar experiences about those 2 issues, healthcare and climate change.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the flooding that we're seeing across the Midwest. We've been out and been visiting with folks in those communities, towns of a population size of 500 people. Their entire town is gone. It's completely wiped out. Millions of dollars of their grain that they had in store. See the I don't know what they call it, but the big structures that they hold the grain in exploded and just spilled out. I mean, and that is their income and their ability to support their families, not just this year, but next year and the following year. What to speak of the fact that they won't be able to farm for quite a while. So it is, I mean, when you look at these practical impacts, there are more people saying, well, I can't attribute this to anything else but that. What are we doing? What should we be doing, both to build resilience, but also to look at how we are farming, look at how we're living, look at where we're getting our fuel from. What are the contributors to climate change, and what do we need to address that both here, and how do we work with other countries to make the kind of change globally that ultimately will be necessary if we really want to make an impact.
One more thing on impeachment. I've heard that also, that, in districts and in, other states, people rarely get the question on impeachment. And in fact, in New York and San Francisco, you get it a lot. I get that.
Yeah.
My issue on impeachment isn't that we should run on it in 2020 as a campaign issue. I think that's a huge mistake. The issue is a much bigger one, which is if we don't do something more extreme and hold him accountable, we're just setting a precedent, even if we win in 2020, that future presidents will be completely immune from oversight. I think it's a bigger issue. That's why I don't think you have to run on it, but I think that the House should absolutely move forward with it and do their job, but not make it a campaign issue if possible.
Yeah.
Seconded.
Yeah.
It was seconded? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm telling all the 2020 candidates that. I think a lot of candidates mistake those of us that are hugely in favor of impeachment immediately with, we're telling you to run on it. We're not doing that. We're saying it's a much bigger issue. It's part of the day-to-day job and one of the biggest responsibilities of the House. To do that and then run your campaign as you are.
Yeah.
But there are political
on other issues
consequences.
that matter.
What people are worried about on the other side of the point is that
The political consequences are so stark that you basically tee him up, right? Because the Senate's never going to do it, and then maybe you have a repeat of what happened with Clinton, where people actually, public perception switched, right? So that's a concern, I think. But I hear your point.
The narrative that there will be blowback on the Democrats is really a Republican narrative,
right?
And Clinton didn't refuse to comply with every single subpoena.
Yeah.
It's a very different situation.
Yeah.
Today.
Yeah.
So anyway.
No,
Yeah.
fair point.
No, it's a point well taken that really does have to do with accountability. I think one of my major concerns, in addition to what I mentioned, is that this will, even though we're saying, well, we're not going to run on it, that this will consume the United States Congress for the next however long it go. And then there won't be any other issue that's brought up. There won't be any other issue that's addressed. We can introduce legislation, we can do these other things, but it will become an all-consuming thing that will be inescapable. So, I mean, you bring up a valid point, though, about accountability. I think this is the kind of conversation that we should be having I think the problem that I've seen in Washington is statements made by different leaders in Congress have been all about the political calculation, which for me, for everyday Americans, are like, that. Seriously, I'm sick and tired of you guys playing politics. Talk about what's real. And so if we're making an argument about accountability, we should have that argument and have that discussion rather than saying, well, we should or shouldn't for political reasons. And then Trump and Republicans saying, well, they should or shouldn't because it's going to help or hurt us. So I think we've got to get to the heart of the problem and address that.
Odessa?
I just want to say it's such a pleasure to hear you talk because I've been a fan for a while.
Thank you.
I think that you go straight to the heart of what is wrong, in so many ways.
She flew here early to see you. She's from Los Angeles,
wow.
actually. Just want to point that
Thank you
out.
so much.
Yeah, so give a round for
Late
Odessa,
last
please,
night.
everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. I just so like I said, I've been a fan for a while, and so then a friend of mine sent me an article, which I'd love for you to clear up on. He was Syrian who wrote it about a legislation that you voted for on refugees, and I'd love to know what your stance is on that because they said that you voted for the legislation that made it very difficult for the country to accept refugees, and we now only take in about 20,000 a year, and this country's built on immigration, and I'm very involved in the refugee sector, so it sort of confused me because the messages were conflicting, and I'd love to just clear it up and hear exactly from you what your stance is.
Yeah, great, thank you. No, I'm glad to have the opportunity to do that. My vote for that legislation was based on two things. It was based on information that we were getting from the Obama administration at that time. This is when that vote took place, I believe in 2015 or 16, where the question was about the vetting process for refugees coming into this country, which is already rigorous. And what the bill said is that I believe it was the Department of Homeland Security, but the administration would need to certify that vetting took place to make sure that we don't have, members of Al Qaeda abusing our refugee system to come into our country and to pose a threat. And so we questioned the administration on this and why they were opposed to that, because it seemed on its face as a no-brainer that the vetting process exists to make sure that the program is not abused. And their response to us was, well, we'd have to hire more people to do that. That was their argument. Said, okay, well, if we want to make sure that the process works and you need more people to do that, why don't you ask Congress for the resources to do that? They didn't really have an answer. So to me, that was not an acceptable argument. My vote for that was to say, if our system doesn't work, then the whole thing shuts down. And we saw that during the during the Bush administration, I believe, when there were two people who came into our country as refugees, Kansas or Kentucky, one of those states, where they went, and then they started plotting an attack against the United States from from wherever they were. They were caught. There was no attack. There was nothing that happened. But when they were caught, no refugees from any country were let in for, I believe, 6 months to a year. The entire system shut down. So if there are holes in our system, it actually threatens the entire refugee program, rather than actually saying, let's make sure our system is working so that we can welcome in refugees who are seeking asylum in this country. So that's where there's misunderstandings about both why that bill came about, as well as my vote on it. It was to strengthen our refugee system, to make sure that we would not again be in a position where every person who wants to come and seek asylum in this country would end up being blocked if and when that system would shut down again, as it had in the past. My record in Congress is strong, as I've joined with my colleagues to get more funding for our refugee program, to be able to welcome in more people into this country, and denouncing the actions of this administration in drastically reducing the numbers of people who are allowed to come in and seek asylum here.
So did that legislation it involve something about you needed a background check from like the Assad government?
No.
It didn't,
No.
right? Okay, because
No.
somebody
It
said
was
I
purely-
was like,
no,
that's
because
crazy
that's-
because the Assad's never going to give a background
No,
check for a
no,
refugee.
and how could, no, I mean,
Okay, because
that doesn't make any sense at all.
I was like, that's got to be your
We would not have any input or information or no, that would have been ridiculous. It was
basically-
purely on the administration saying certify that the vetting program, the vetting system that is in place works.
Right. Okay.
That's what it did.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then they didn't want to supply the employees to make sure that that vetting system could work. Or
They didn't want to take responsibility for saying, yes, I certify that this works, unless they had more resources to do so.
Right.
But they also were not asking for more resources to do so. So, thanks for
Thank you.
asking.
Yeah, no, that definitely made it much more clear because it wasn't adding up. I was like, I don't think that's her stance.
Yeah. Thank you for exercising some healthy skepticism.
Right. Joe?
It feels like, and Omeed and I have done things here at Core Club for people like Max Rose and Antonio Delgado that turned Republican districts Democrat by what I would describe as a much more moderate strategy than or message than the Democratic Party. But as I look nationally, and it feels like the party is moving further to the left, further away from where you are. And I guess my question is it going to take a 2020 devastation to have that correct, or can the party still survive the next round? Can it come back to a place that it's actually talking to most Americans and not to 5% of them?
You know, I think that it may take that, but I think that, in my view, we're looking at this the wrong way. That this is not about, left America versus middle versus right. I think the problem is trying to pigeonhole different people, different candidates into these different boxes, when really when you see people like Max Rose and Antonio, Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania, even they don't fit cleanly within one box or another. I think what I saw in them and what I see as I connect with people and what I see in myself is looking at issues based on the substance, saying, okay, how do I feel about this? Where do I stand on it? How will it impact people? Whether it's a quote-unquote progressive position or a conservative position or a moderate position, taking the best of the ideas that we have and saying, hey, my goal is not to serve one section of my party or another, it's to actually serve the people in my community, then I'm going to find the best way to do that. And that's where we need to go. That's where I believe there is this clarion call from people across the country, across party lines, just saying, let's use our common sense and work together, recognizing you and I might disagree on some issues and how to approach them and how to find solutions, but we're going to agree on a lot of other things. Let's work out a way towards delivering those results for people, rather than even within our own party saying, hey, I'm this, you're that, I'm right, you're wrong, my side's going to win, you're going to lose, we're going to do everything we can do to take you out. Meanwhile, people are just left like, what about us? To me, that's the problem. And when you look at the arguments within our own party, the arguments in the media in Washington, it's all kind of centered around socialists versus capitalists, progressives versus moderates, centrists, like all these things that's missing the whole point, in my opinion.
I seriously think that's like the most important soliloquy you can hear from a politician, and not even to use that like in a pejorative way, right? Because they don't speak that way.
Yeah.
if you accept the premise that both our domestic economic policy and our foreign policy is antiquated and insufficient at the establishment level, then people fitting into one of those two boxes doesn't help anything.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the point of what you're doing and some of the people you mentioned. So we, depending on where you are on the spectrum, if you want to improve the country as opposed to just trying to win for the sake of winning, you have to start embracing this on an issue-by-issue basis. And that, I really think, is the whole kind of reason why I'm supporting this candidacy, is that she's doing that in a way that nobody else is doing it on either side. And it's why so much of the country gravitated towards Trump. We just need to accept that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, Congresswoman, do you think media is again misreading the voters' will? Like they haven't learned the lesson in 2016 getting Mr. Trump elected? And for example, I mean, I have full respect for Mr. Biden, and they are promoting him just on the basis of that he is the only candidate who can defeat Mr. Trump. Yeah. In my view, I think all of the candidates on the Democratic side, including you, of course, can defeat him, actually. I mean, recently I just came back from India last week, and the big newspapers, Time magazine, this said about Mr. Modi, he's a divider in chief. I mean, the front page, and when the election results came, everybody got shocked. He got majority, actually, and they misread. Do you think it is again happening here? Or how important it is for you to have exposure in media, actually?
Well, the exposure in media is very important because I need to let people in the country know who I am and why I'm running for president, and experience that I bring. I think it's what we're trying to do is to get exposure across both, the mainstream media, the cable news, the new media, the podcasts, the bloggers, just across the board, because more and more people are getting their information from other sources. I do think they're getting it wrong, and I think the media has such an incredible responsibility to report news and the truth, and that's just not what we see anymore. We see opinions, we see panels of people on all the news channels, I don't care which one you watch, sharing their opinions. You can agree or disagree with their opinion, but in all of that, the facts and the news are lost. Me and my campaign, we've been on the receiving end of very intentional smear efforts trying to undermine our campaign, coming through, NBC News, quoting articles that are completely baseless. Not just like, hey, you got a couple of things wrong in that. No, completely baseless. And I did an interview with George Stephanopoulos. He's like, well, this article in the Daily Beast says Putin supports your campaign. Based on what? Nothing. Really, nothing. Because I have 3 donors out of nearly 80,000 who, like me, 3 Americans, I hate that I have to say that, but 3 American donors, Susan Sarandon, one of them, Professor Stephen Cohen, another, both of whom are outspoken as I am, saying we need to de-escalate tensions between the United States and nuclear-armed countries like Russia and China, because otherwise we are headed down a path that inevitably takes us to nuclear war. Let's figure out how we work with other countries rather than continuing this path of conflict. End regime change wars. They're saying the same things that I'm saying about the dangers of nuclear war. And because of that, they, and therefore I, am labeled as a Russophile and a supporter of Putin.
By
it's
Democrats,
just ridiculous.
by the way, that's the Twilight Zone where
exactly.
you're being attacked by
exactly.
people on the purported left.
Yeah.
For that.
I saw your interview on Joe Scarborough, I think, one time, in the morning Joe, and I saw
that was great, wasn't it?
That was good, actually. I really appreciate the way you control the situation there. Actually. They tried to ambush you, actually.
Yeah.
I know.
Thank you.
Did we have one more couple? Let's just do a couple more before as we wrap up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the challenges prohibiting growth in the economy? Where do you think the country should be investing, either domestically or internationally? Any areas that you think we need to really put some capital behind?
Do you want to just take all 3?
Yeah, let's take all 3.
And then we'll
Perfect.
wrap up.
Greg?
Do you want to? Okay, yeah. Behind you, and then one more behind you.
Thank you so much. Tulsi, I'm from a town of 2,500 people from Cleveland, Ohio. When Trump ran and announced, I said he's going to win. And the reason why is because people are, people in the Midwest are like fighting to pay their mortgage, put their kids through school. When they think, they're not thinking about world, politics. Yeah. They're not thinking about anything else but their own little community. And when they went to vote, they can't think about anything. They look at what do they think about Trump? They think, oh, he's rich, he's successful, and that was about it. Yeah. And when you look at, the people that have won, it's been since Trump. Everybody who's won has raised the most money. He won through social media. Mm-hmm. The people that have the biggest social media have 15 million followers are showing, their butts, and that's why they're famous, right? So how are you going to simplify it and get people at all ages to understand you, to appreciate you, and to vote for you? Yeah. That's the question.
Thank you.
Mine's really simple. What do you think are your biggest challenges to getting elected in the kind of construct that the nation is in right now?
Yeah, perfect. I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to pretend to tell you here's where you should put your money and where you should invest in. I think I want to comment more broadly just on the trade policy that we have right now, and that Trump is exacerbating and screwing up, in my view. Seeing and talking to a lot of the folks who are impacted by this trade and tariff war that's being waged. He's being tough on China, tough on Mexico, tough on all these other countries. It's really having a devastating impact on domestic manufacturers, on domestic farmers, on small businesses who are facing such incredible uncertainty. Not knowing where they should put their money, how they can plan ahead if there are tough times coming, if taxes are being increased, if tariffs are being increased, their costs are going to be going up. All of these things are already having a very direct impact, and that will continue to impact every one of us with projections saying we're going to pay, $800, $1,000 more just in the coming year because of all these increases. So I just say I think we've got to look at the trade policies that we have, recognize that some of them have been very flawed and that end up having negative repercussions on American jobs and American businesses, and look at how we can address some of the trade imbalances that exist and some of the problems that we have with other countries with a more sensible approach that provides a path of certainty that ultimately strengthens our economy. I know this is a big topic, but it's something that I'm going to be focusing on through the campaign in the coming in the next few months. I think both of the other two questions are linked. Both the greatest challenge, but how do we reach people? And that's really the thing is, yes, through social media. Most of my media investments right now, the vast majority of where we're putting the money that we're getting from contributors is going towards social media, getting across and reaching folks where they are. And talking about issues in a way that resonates with them, and also hearing, what they care about and connecting with them there. What we see is as my message gets to people, we get more supporters, we get more commitments from people who say they'll vote, we get more people who want to join our campaign. And really, if I can encapsulate the whole thing, how we connect with people. Like you're saying, when people go, they say, hey, Trump is rich and powerful, maybe he'll do something to make me rich and powerful. Very simply, when we look at what's at the heart of the problem, it comes down to the people have been left behind by a Washington that cares more for itself than the people. So the message that I hope people get from me and what they think of when they go into that booth to cast their vote is service above self, is someone who's dedicated their life to serving this country and wants to continue that service to put their well-being, their interests, the interests of our country above all else.
I think the way to kind of close this is that if this message resonated with you, and I think it's hard not to, we really need to help donate to this campaign. And so you can do that by going on Tulsi2020.com. But in order to craft and keep this message going, You need to help underwrite it, and the media is not helping.
Yeah.
So that's why you have added pressure to meet a diverse set of folks in these types of forums to get the message out, and that's how we're going to continue it. So please donate whatever you can to make sure this message continues. It's really important. I've maxed out personally, so I am putting my money where my mouth is, and I'm not just asking other people to do it. So everyone that I know, I'm asking to help, and I'm asking all of you to help as well. So with that, we'll close, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I really
Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it. Thank you. Awesome.
Great job.
Thank you very much. That's
Thank
great.
you. That was really nice.
Fantastic.
Very casual.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was cool.
Yeah.
I think people really
Everybody jumped in.
Yeah, totally. That was great.